At the edge of the known world, where the Pacific Ocean stretches farther than any empire ever dared to rule, a nation was born not from conquest, but from courage. Long before America declared independence, before Europe mapped the globe, master navigators crossed an ocean so vast it seemed endless. With no compass, no steel, no engines, only stars, wind, and memory, they found a land rising from the mist. They called it Aotearoa. Here, in a landscape of towering mountains, volcanic fire, and ancient forests, the Maori built a civilization defined by honor, warfare, kinship, and spiritual law. Fortified hilltop pa guarded tribal territories. Oral traditions preserved centuries of knowledge. The land was not owned, it was ancestral. Then, sails appeared on the horizon. European explorers brought trade, muskets, missionaries, and empire. Promises were written in ink, but understood in different worlds. The Treaty of Waitangi would shape the destiny of a nation, igniting wars, resistance, and a struggle over sovereignty that still echoes today. From tribal kingdoms to a modern democracy, from world wars to cultural renaissance, New Zealand's story is one of resilience, conflict, and reinvention. This is the complete history of New Zealand, ancient to modern. In an age when much of the world lay beyond the reach of maps, the Pacific Ocean stretched vast and unbroken, a realm of beauty and danger. For the Polynesian navigators of East Polynesia, however, this ocean was not a barrier, but a pathway. Guided by stars, ocean swells, bird flight, and memory passed down through generations, they mastered one of the most sophisticated systems of navigation ever developed without instruments. Between 1200 and 1300 CE, double-hulled voyaging canoes set out across thousands of kilometers of open sea. These vessels carried families, food supplies, and cultural knowledge, built to endure months on the ocean. Each voyage demanded precision and courage, as navigators read subtle signs in wind, waves, and sky to locate islands beyond the horizon. These journeys were deliberate acts of exploration, not accidents of drift. Eventually, a new land emerged from the mist, Aotearoa. Its climate was colder, its winds harsher, and its landscapes unlike the tropical islands left behind. Forests, rivers, and mountains defined a world that required adaptation. Those who settled here became the first Maori, reshaping Polynesian knowledge to survive and thrive in this unfamiliar environment. Communities formed around wānau and cooperation. Crops were adjusted to colder seasons, fishing techniques evolved, and forests became vital sources of food, shelter, and spiritual meaning. Oral traditions preserved history, genealogy, and survival knowledge, binding people to both ancestors and land. Though settled, the ocean remained central. Voyages continued, maintaining connections across the Pacific, and from this balance of sea and land emerged a distinct Maori identity, rooted in navigation, resilience, and deep environmental understanding, long before the arrival of the outside world. In the centuries after first settlement, Aotearoa evolved from untouched wilderness into a landscape shaped by human knowledge and restraint. Maori communities learned that survival in this new land required deep observation and respect for nature. Forests provided food and shelter, rivers sustained life, and mountains served as spiritual anchors. The environment was not conquered, it was understood. Social structures matured around wānau, hapu, and iwi, creating systems of cooperation, defense, and resource management. Leadership rested with rangatira, whose authority came from both ancestry and proven wisdom. Tikanga governed all aspects of life, blending law, morality, and responsibility into a single code. Justice was based on balance and reciprocity rather than punishment alone. Land was central to identity. It was held collectively, tied to ancestors and future generations. Settlements were carefully positioned near fertile soils, waterways, and defensible terrain. Fortified PA rose on hills and ridges, combining military function with social organization and engineering skill. These structures reflected both the need for protection and a deep respect for the land they occupied. Agriculture flourished through innovation. Kumara cultivation adapted to colder climates using raised beds and seasonal planning. Fishing, hunting, and gathering remained vital, carried out with tools crafted from stone, bone, and flax. These activities required cooperation, knowledge, and ritual, reinforcing social bonds. Spiritual life was inseparable from survival. Knowledge of seasons, tides, and stars was preserved through oral tradition. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Maori society had become a resilient civilization, ethically bound to the land, adaptable to change, and grounded in ancestry, capable of thriving within the limits of Aotearoa itself. By the early 17th century, Aotearoa had flourished in long isolation. Maori society was deeply attuned to the land, guided by ancestral knowledge of seasons, food cycles, and kinship. Forests, rivers, and coasts shaped daily life, while social order rested on custom, reciprocity, and collective responsibility. It was a civilization balanced between survival and meaning. That balance was first disturbed in 1642, and when Dutch explorer Abel Tasman sighted the coastline during the European Age of Exploration. His voyage, driven by trade and ambition for the Dutch East India Company, marked the first recorded European contact with New Zealand. To Maori observers, the foreign ships appeared vast and unfamiliar. Misunderstandings quickly arose, and a brief confrontation near Golden Bay resulted in the deaths of 4 Dutch sailors. Tasman withdrew without landing, leaving behind only maps, names, and unanswered questions. For more than a century afterward, European contact remained rare. Aotearoa existed on the edges of European knowledge, sketched imperfectly on maps, while Maori life continued unchanged. Villages thrived, gardens were cultivated, and spiritual connections to land and ancestry remained strong. In 1769, sustained contact began with the arrival of Captain James Cook aboard HMS Endeavour. Sent to chart the coastline and observe the natural world, Cook approached cautiously, recording land, people, and resources in detail. Maori responses were equally deliberate, marked by observation, exchange, and negotiation. Canoes surrounded the ship as communities assessed intent and risk. These early encounters revealed deep cultural differences, particularly around land, authority, and exchange. Yet Maori communities exercised agency, controlling access and shaping engagement. By the voyage's end, New Zealand was fully mapped, and 2 worlds, once separate, had acknowledged one another, setting the stage for profound and lasting change. In the late 18th century, Aotearoa entered a period of rapid transformation. European ships arrived with increasing frequency, bringing iron tools, firearms, and new ideas that challenged long-established Maori ways of life. For generations, society had been shaped by kinship, land stewardship, and customary law. Now, trade introduced forces that would permanently alter power, warfare, and survival. Whalers, sealers, and traders were among the first Europeans to remain for extended periods. They exchanged metal tools, cloth, and eventually muskets for food, labor, and protection. These items were valued not as curiosities but as instruments of change. Iron tools improved farming and construction, while firearms dramatically altered intertribal warfare. Chiefs carefully controlled access to trade, recognizing that European goods could strengthen authority and territorial influence. The spread of muskets triggered the Musket Wars, a period of intensified conflict marked by shifting alliances, population displacement, and widespread violence. Traditional PA and battle strategies were redesigned, and entire communities migrated to escape attack or seek protection. The demographic and political landscape of Aotearoa was reshaped by both fear and adaptation. At the same time, missionaries arrived with Christianity and literacy. Figures like Samuel Marsden promoted education and religious conversion, recording language and genealogy while challenging traditional beliefs. Literacy offered new tools for communication and negotiation, even as it disrupted spiritual authority. Trade, faith, and firearms reshaped Maori society in complex ways. While destruction and insecurity increased, Maori communities demonstrated resilience. integrating new technologies while preserving core values of land, kinship, and identity. Aotearoa was no longer isolated. It had entered a global world where survival demanded adaptation without surrender. At the dawn of the 19th century, Aotearoa stood at a turning point. Maori society had adapted to decades of trade, firearms, and missionary influence, integrating new tools while preserving kinship, land stewardship, and spiritual authority. Chiefs governed communities shaped by both tradition and change, yet beyond the horizon, British imperial interest in the Pacific was rapidly intensifying. By 1840, Britain sought formal control over New Zealand. Rising European settlement, fears of foreign rivals, and unregulated trade pushed colonial officials toward negotiation rather than conquest. Maori were numerous, organized, and deeply attached to land and mana, making diplomacy essential. From this pressure emerged the Treaty of Waitangi, a document intended to establish governance, protect Maori rights, and legitimize British authority. The treaty's language, however, carried profound ambiguity. In English, it asserted British sovereignty. In Maori, the term kawanatanga implied limited governance rather than absolute rule. Maori chiefs understood the agreement as a partnership, one that would protect land and authority while enabling cooperation. Each signature was a deliberate act, shaped by strategy, caution, and hope. On the 6th of February, 1840, at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands, over 40 rangatira met British representatives. Chiefs debated openly, questioning intentions and weighing risks. In the months that followed, the treaty traveled across the islands, signed in multiple locations as leaders assessed its value for protection, trade, and stability. Yet misunderstandings were embedded from the outset. Britain viewed the treaty as a transfer of sovereignty. Maori saw it as shared authority. These conflicting interpretations laid the groundwork for future disputes. What was signed as an agreement of coexistence became a fragile foundation, one that would shape New Zealand's colonial history for generations to come. In the decades after the Treaty of Waitangi, Aotearoa became a landscape of tension and transformation. European settlement accelerated, fueled by land speculation and imperial ambition. Forests were cleared, towns built, and harbors reshaped, marking the end of centuries of Maori isolation and land stewardship. The treaty's promise of partnership was tested immediately. The Crown claimed sovereignty, while Maori understood land as ancestral inheritance tied to identity and mana. Conflicts over these differing worldviews escalated as surveys, sales, and settlement encroached on traditional territories. By the mid-1840s, tensions erupted into armed conflict. The Northern War, 1845 to 1846, led by Hone Hake, saw Maori challenge British authority, cutting down flags and defending PA with innovative fortifications. Across Waikato and Taranaki, disputes over fertile land intensified during the 1850s and 1860s. Maori employed trenches, bunkers, and knowledge of terrain to counter regiments, artillery, and naval support. Villages burned, crops were destroyed, and families displaced, yet Maori resilience and strategy endured. Colonial legislation, including the New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863, confiscated vast tracts of land, undermining sovereignty and opening fertile territory for settlers. Social cohesion was disrupted, but kinship, traditions, and strategic negotiation persisted. Maori adapted to changing circumstances, forming alliances, asserting claims through legal channels, and sustaining mana through acts of resistance. By the 1870s, Aotearoa bore the scars of war, on the land, in communities, and across generations. The era was a crucible of sovereignty, identity, and resilience. Maori strategy, agency, and adaptability slowed conquest, yet colonization reshaped social structures, political authority, and the struggle over land, marking a defining chapter in the island's history. By the late 19th century, Aotearoa had entered a new era. The wars had ended, and European settlers pressed forward with confidence, reshaping the land through towns, railways, ports, and farms. New Zealand emerged as a self-governing colony, its landscapes transformed by roads, telegraph lines, and expanding urban centers such as Auckland, Wellington, and Dunedin. Trade flourished, steamships filled harbors, and European systems of property, labor, and governance became dominant. Settler society embraced a powerful sense of optimism. Democratic institutions expanded, education became widespread, and public infrastructure grew rapidly. New Zealand gained international attention for progressive reforms, most notably in 1893, when it became the first self-governing country to grant women the right to vote. To settlers, the colony appeared to be a modern, forward-looking society built on law, order, and opportunity. Yet this progress rested on unequal foundations. Maori communities, weakened by land confiscations and the legacy of the New Zealand Wars, often faced economic hardship and political marginalization. Ancestral lands were fragmented, access to resources restricted, and colonial laws favored settler ownership and authority. While towns prospered, many Maori communities were excluded from the benefits of growth. Identity became divided. Settler belonging was defined through European heritage and colonial institutions, while Maori identity remained rooted in whakapapa, land, and marae. Despite constraints, Maori adapted, negotiated, and preserved cultural continuity. By century's end, Aotearoa stood as a nation of ambition and contradiction, celebrated for reform and progress, yet marked by unresolved injustice. Beneath the confidence of the settler state lay enduring tensions over land, identity, and the legacy of dispossession. At the dawn of the 20th century, New Zealand stood remote from Europe's tensions, yet firmly tied to the British Empire by loyalty, culture, and trade. When war broke out in 1914, the nation was drawn into a global conflict that would test its identity and unity. Though distant from the battlefields, New Zealand mobilized rapidly, sending thousands of soldiers from farms, towns, and cities to serve overseas. Young men departed from ports such as Wellington and Auckland, bound by duty to the empire and a growing sense of national pride. The defining moment came in 1915 at Gallipoli, where New Zealand troops fought alongside Australian and British forces. The campaign was brutal. Steep terrain, relentless artillery, disease, and exhaustion inflicted heavy losses. Though a military failure, Gallipoli became a powerful symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and shared hardship. From this experience emerged the Anzac identity, rooted in courage and collective memory. Maori participation was central to this transformation. Maori leaders encouraged enlistment as a statement of equality and belonging. The Maori Pioneer Battalion played a vital role, constructing trenches and supply routes under fire. Their service reinforced Maori claims to citizenship and recognition within the nation. On the home front, war reshaped daily life. Women took on new responsibilities in agriculture, industry, and voluntary service, while communities faced grief and absence. Newspapers, ceremonies, and public gatherings ensured the sacrifices were remembered. By war's end, New Zealand saw itself differently, not merely as a distant colony, but as a nation forged through shared sacrifice. The First World War left deep scars, yet it also solidified a lasting sense of unity, resilience, and national identity. In the mid-20th century, New Zealand emerged from the upheaval of two world wars into a period of cautious optimism and rapid change. Though marked by loss and memory, the nation gained new confidence, believing it could shape its future through social reform, economic growth, and self-governance. The foundations laid during the 1930s and 1940s, industrial expansion, agricultural productivity, and wartime mobilization, now fueled post-war prosperity. By the 1950s, economic growth supported the expansion of a modern welfare state. Governments invested heavily in housing, healthcare, education, and social security, aiming to protect citizens from poverty and instability. Manufacturing grew in major cities, while dairy and sheep farming sustained exports. Urban centers such as Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch expanded rapidly, drawing people from rural areas into suburbs and industrial districts. Public housing, transport networks, and schools reshaped everyday life, creating a more mobile and connected society. For Maori communities, this transformation brought both opportunity and disruption. Large numbers migrated from tribal lands to cities in search of work and education, a shift that weakened traditional social structures and contributed to language decline and cultural dislocation. While urban life offered economic advancement, state policies often ignored Maori cultural needs, reinforcing inequalities in housing, health, and employment. Despite these tensions, the era reflected ambition and belief in progress. Improved living standards, rising literacy, and accessible healthcare transformed daily life for many families. Yet beneath prosperity lay unresolved challenges of inclusion, identity, and equity. By mid-century, New Zealand stood at a crossroads, confident in its modern institutions, yet still negotiating how to balance growth with cultural continuity and social justice in a rapidly changing world. In the early 1970s, New Zealand reached a turning point. Decades of post-war growth had modernized cities and industries, yet deep inequalities persisted. For Maori communities, rapid urban migration brought employment and education, but also cultural dislocation. Ancestral ties weakened, language use declined, and traditional structures were marginalized. A new generation emerged determined to reclaim identity, rights, and visibility. This awakening was shaped by global movements for civil rights and decolonization. Urban Maori, increasingly aware of disparities in health, housing, education, and employment, challenged a system that had failed to honor the Treaty of Waitangi. Signed in 1840, the treaty had long been treated as symbolic rather than binding, its promises neglected by the state. The 1975 Land March, led by Winna Cooper, became a defining moment. Marching from Te Hapua to Wellington, protesters demanded recognition of ongoing land loss and injustice. The march captured national attention, demonstrating the power of peaceful resistance and reaffirming Maori presence in public life. That same year, the government established the Waitangi Tribunal, creating a formal process to examine treaty breaches. Though initially limited in scope, it signaled a major shift toward accountability and dialogue. Cultural revival unfolded alongside political activism. Kohanga reo programs began revitalizing Te Reo Maori, while Maori literature, arts, and media reclaimed indigenous voices. Urban Maori became centers of organization and education. By the end of the decade, Maori activism had reshaped national debate. The Maori Renaissance redefined identity, justice, and belonging, laying the foundation for legal reform, cultural survival, and a more inclusive vision of Aotearoa. In the late 20th century, New Zealand began redefining itself beyond its colonial inheritance. No longer viewing itself solely through the lens of European settlement, the nation increasingly recognized its place within a wider Pacific world, an oceanic region bound by shared histories, migration, and cultural exchange. This shift coincided with profound demographic transformation. Immigration from the Pacific Islands, Asia, and other regions reshaped cities and towns across Aotearoa. Auckland, in particular, evolved into one of the most culturally diverse cities in the Pacific, where Samoan, Tongan, Fijian, Chinese, Indian, and many other communities contributed languages, traditions, religions, and enterprise to the national fabric. Markets, schools, workplaces, and festivals reflected this growing multicultural identity. As society changed, so too did foreign policy. The Pacific Ocean came to be seen not as isolation but connection. From the 1980s onward, New Zealand strengthened diplomatic and development ties throughout Oceania, supporting disaster relief, environmental cooperation, and regional stability. The country positioned itself as a mediator and advocate for Pacific interests, often promoting dialogue and sustainability in a region influenced by larger global powers. This marked a symbolic realignment, a small nation asserting leadership through partnership rather than empire. Domestically, policies increasingly acknowledged multicultural realities. Education incorporated Pacific and Maori histories, while urban planning and social services adapted to more diverse communities. Government institutions made gradual efforts to include Māori and Pacific perspectives in decision-making. Environmental stewardship also became central to national identity. Recognizing vulnerability to climate change and ecological degradation, New Zealand expanded conservation initiatives and marine protections. Sustainability aligned closely with the Maori principle of kaitiakitanga, guardianship of land and sea, blending indigenous values with modern environmental policy. Yet transformation brought tension. Immigration challenged traditional definitions of national identity, prompting debates over citizenship, integration, and representation. Maori communities, despite cultural resurgence and treaty settlements, continued to negotiate their place within a society increasingly shaped by non-indigenous diversity. Pacific communities also confronted social and economic barriers, even as their cultural contributions enriched national life. These dynamics revealed identity as evolving and negotiated rather than fixed. Economic globalization further reshaped the nation. Trade agreements, technological innovation, and engagement with Asian markets reoriented New Zealand's economy toward the Pacific Rim. Leaders balanced economic growth with social equity and environmental protection, drawing lessons from a history marked by colonization and inequality. Culture became a unifying force. Maori revival and Pacific arts, literature, and scholarship gained prominence, supported by universities and public institutions. National celebrations and festivals reflected shared recognition of diverse heritages. By the dawn of the 21st century, New Zealand stood as a Pacific nation, aware of its colonial past, enriched by multiculturalism, and navigating the responsibilities of regional leadership. The work of integration and justice remained ongoing, but the country had firmly embraced an identity shaped not only by Europe, but by the vast and interconnected Pacific world. Here is your text converted into approximately 400 words, keeping the cinematic and documentary tone intact. In the 21st century, New Zealand stands not as a finished story, but as a nation engaged in reflection and debate. Shaped by ocean, volcano, and centuries of migration, its history is layered and complex. So from the arrival of Polynesian navigators to European colonization, industrial growth, and modern immigration, the country's identity has developed through adaptation and negotiation rather than a single, linear path. Across urban streets and remote coastlines alike, the dialogue between past and present continues. At the center of this conversation remains the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840. Once treated as a historical formality, it is now regarded as a living covenant. Legal institutions, tribunals, and political forums continue to examine its meaning, especially regarding sovereignty, justice, and partnership. Maori communities seek recognition not only of land and resources, but of mana, authority, and self-determination. Their efforts address the enduring impacts of confiscation and colonization, while also advocating for equitable systems that shape the nation's future. Simultaneously, New Zealand navigates the realities of multiculturalism. Pacific Island communities, Asian migrants, and refugees have transformed urban centers into vibrant spaces of cultural exchange. Auckland and Wellington reflect this diversity in language, commerce, and daily life. Yet these changes raise questions about inclusion and fairness. Who shares in prosperity, and how do historical inequalities influence present opportunities? Environmental responsibility also defines contemporary national identity. Vulnerable to climate change and ecological pressures, New Zealand emphasizes sustainability and conservation. The Maori concept of kaitiakitanga, guardianship of land and sea, has influenced public understanding of environmental stewardship, linking ancient principles with modern policy. Education and public discourse further reflect this evolving awareness. Curriculum reforms increasingly address colonization and indigenous perspectives, encouraging students to view history as complex and contested. Museums and archives preserve difficult histories, prompting ongoing reflection rather than simple celebration. Political debates mirror these broader tensions. Issues of governance, resource management, and social equity demonstrate a country balancing tradition with reform. Each policy decision carries historical weight, reminding citizens that progress requires acknowledgement of the past. New Zealand today is defined less by certainty than by engagement. Its landscapes, from volcanic mountains to glacial fjords, stand as reminders that history is deeply rooted in place. As conversations about sovereignty, identity, and sustainability continue, the nation moves forward thoughtfully, aware that understanding its past remains essential to shaping its future.